Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the all-new Haunted Dolls and Curses video. Well, I had a lot of fun the other day when I was talking about screaming skulls for the very first time. Very fun, very interesting topic. And so I thought to myself, let me go ahead and see if I can find another legendary screaming skull story. And yet here we are. I was able to find this information associated with a skull that if you go to this particular manor, it is still there to this very day. Very eerie how apparently you can go see this skull in person, and once you hear this legend, then you'll know exactly what it entails, like when it comes to what you're looking at right in front of you. So those of you that have been fortunate enough to go see this skull, and that's definitely something that's really, really neat. You know how much I love the thought of being able to go to a very specific spot and then seeing whatever the video is about. But in this case, it has to do with this skull that's located in a manor called the Bettiscombe Manor. So this is called the Screaming Skull of Bettiscombe Manor. At least that's what the legend is called. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating information associated with this legend. I wanted to mention this up front, though. There seems to be variations of this legend, and I'll try to mention both options, like both versions of the legend, because it seems like through the passage of time some of the information has been diluted. So it may be one avenue, maybe another avenue. I'll just try to present both here, but both of them ultimately lead to this screaming skull. So here's how the legend starts. Apparently it all began with a man by the name of Azariah Piney, and he was someone who was an owner. I guess he was either, based on the legend, he was either an owner of slaves or he was a slave himself. And either way, though, he was living somewhere there in England, but he was banished. For whatever reason, he was going to be in a position, really, really bad one too, where he was almost executed. But it seems like a payment of a certain number of pounds, like a bribery of sorts, allowed him to escape. And he was able to be deported to the West Indies to a location called Nevis. And either here, again, based on the legend, either here he was a slave that eventually became a free man, or he was already a slave owner and then prospered with his own plantation there. Either way, though, the way the legend continues was he eventually came into a possession of his own slave, like another very faithful black servant. And so this servant is the one that's going to play a key note when it comes to this screaming skull. And then once again, there's a variation on the legend where either A, Azariah himself took his slave with him back to England because somewhere along the way, I guess either he paid enough bribery or time had passed and whatever he was found guilty of was no longer valid, or B, he ended up dying, this guy Azariah, and then it was his son, John Frederick Piney, who in turn took that slave over to England. Either way, though, in both versions, this slave was able to go was able to go from Nevis, his homeland, over to England, and that, of course, was not something that was good for him because now he was being taken away from his homeland. Either way, though, the legend continues that this man was considered someone who was very faithful to the family. He fully served them for a good time period, but somewhere along the way he ended up having tuberculosis, which was a very dangerous thing to have at that time. I don't think there was any cure at that point, so if he pretty much had it, then that was it. You were going to die. And so when he was dying, he asked and he pleaded either A, it was Azariah, or B, his son, John Frederick Piney. He was asking either one of them that should he die, could he please have his body returned back to his homeland of Nevis. And I don't know if they made that promise or not. If they did, then obviously they reneged on the promise, or if they told him no. Either way, though, that led to this next circumstance. So whenever the slave ended up dying, rather than, let's say, having the costs associated with taking that body all the way back to Nevis, it was considered, obviously to them, something along the lines of a expensive burial that just didn't make much sense, especially at that time in their mindset, because he was a slave. And so they ended up burying this guy into a place called St. Stephen's Church Cemetery, and then that's where they buried him, again against his wishes. So either A, it was against his wishes, or B, they just flat out told him no at the beginning. And either way, though, he was not going to have his death wish when it came to being buried buried there in homeland of Nevis. And then that's where the Screaming Skull legend begins. That's essentially where the main activity happens. Apparently, no sooner did that occur than not only did that house become plagued with misfortune, but also the entire village would as well. That area that was surrounding that manor. There were apparently months and months and months of just continuous screams and crying that were heard coming from that cemetery. Not only that, but in the manor itself, those screams would permeate within those halls, within many of the rooms, and there would also be windows that would rattle, walls that would shake. There would be no wind, nothing in terms of any kind of other activity that would cause this stuff to happen, and yet here it was occurring within the manor itself. And then finally, somebody was able to place 2 plus 2 and then realize that this is happening because they didn't fulfill the wishes of the slave when it came to going back to Nevis. Here's where things still get a little bit confusing, because eventually they realized they had to do something, and so they ended up going to the cemetery and taking the body back up from the casket. That's where they noticed that it was no longer like there was no phones, nothing like that. It was more than likely just a skull. At least one version of the legend states only the skull was remaining, and so they decided to take that skull and then place it right there in the manor. No sooner did they did that than everything became okay. There was actually no more issues. There was no more screams. There was no more problems associated with windows rattling. I believe there were also spectral figures that were seen here and there. The whole point, though, is the Screaming Skull of the slave decided that he would be satisfied. That's where it got a little confusing for me, because, again, if his death wish was to be back in his homeland, it seemed like things were now okay if he was just placed back into the manor. Who knows? Maybe it was a place that he ended up really loving when he was serving all those years there at that manor, and this would have placated him when it came to that. But who knows? But at least the legend takes another turn afterward. Apparently, the house ended up going to another owner. That owner decided, you know what, this skull, it doesn't look right. I don't want it here in my household. And so they decided to bury it within another graveyard. And of course, no sooner did that happen, than that's where, again, these terrifying moans and scream, and this time there was even further poltergeist activity, all started to have bad things, all started to happen right then and there. And so clearly the skull was taken back, and it was brought back to that manor, into that house, and then everything was a-okay. And then lo and behold, there was yet another circumstance where a couple of decades later, yet another owner decided this is a stupid paranormal legend. Like, that's their mindset. They were thinking that at that time. And then they thought to themselves, I'm going to take this skull and I'm not even going to bury it. I'm just going to throw it into the pond. Like, that's essentially what their thought was when it came to this legend. Of course, within hours of doing so, then that's when there was these quote-unquote demonic screams that started happening. Not only that, but this time the furniture inside that manor, inside that house, actually began smashing against the walls. This is clearly taken the most violent approach yet when it comes to this poltergeist activity. So that owner, of course, quickly realized that they made a very big mistake when it came to throwing the skull in that pond. So they went there, they were able to get that poor slave's skull, and then they put it right there in the home one more time, and then everything was a-okay. And then if you thought that the legend stopped there, nope, it looks like at another point sometime later on, there was yet another owner who wanted to say, this is not going to happen to me. So he ended up taking that skull, and he thought he was going to have a lot of precautions by doing this next thing. He took that skull, and then he got into his back garden a hole. Like, he ended up digging it for hours, and this was as deep as can be, I guess as deep as could allow him, before eventually there was no further point that he could dig. And so he took that skull, threw it in there right in the bottom, and then he spent a couple more hours filling the hole back up. Well, it seems like that night everything was fine, but then by the next morning when he went back into that garden, lo and behold, there he was staring at the skull, standing right on top of that newly filled hole. So somewhere along the way, that skull decided, that screaming skull, that it didn't like, of course, being buried like it was the night before. And so not only did it somehow teleport itself, but it made it right there, invisible sight, obviously to the owner, so that way he could see it whenever he first came out in the morning, and it was letting him know that that was not okay. And so by that point, This screaming skull was placed one last time within the manor, and if you go there to this day again to the Bettiscombe Manor, then you'll be able to see it right there. Apparently, it's located somewhere in the attic, is what I was reading one location or one website stating. So if you go there, and I don't know if they have tours or if they allow you to actually visit on the inside or outside. But either way, though, apparently it's up there in the attic, and it's behind, or I'm sorry, in front of a painting, almost like a painting looking down on it. But there have been really no more issues associated with it. Who knows, though, if any of the current owners have experienced any other type of situation. But as far as the Screaming Skull, this is a real life legend that has passed multiple owners, and it's still there, a physical skull that you can go see to this day. That's what made it so much more interesting to me when it came to this info. But if anybody has anything else I might have missed, maybe someone that actually had the fortune of going to that particular manor and then seeing that Screaming Skull in person, please let me know. That'd be great to hear what your experience was associated with that. But yes, it all originated again from this poor slave who again was just asking for one simple wish, and obviously multiple owners never abided by it, and for some reason now it's happy to be there within that manor. All right, everybody, thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.